911, what is the location of your emergency?
He's here. He's here. He's outside.
Who is outside, Michaela?
My ex. I have order of protection against him.
What's going on? Michaela, what's happening? What happened? Where is she shot?
I can't tell, please. Oh my God. Help me, Lord. Help me, Lord. Help me, Lord.
Welcome back to True Crime Red Flag. Today we're diving into a story that will shake you to your core. A story about a young woman whose life was cut tragically short just hours before her 25th birthday. A story about systemic failures, broken promises of protection, and deadly consequences when those sworn to protect us fall short. On November 15, 2021, in Nashville, Tennessee, 24-year-old Michaela Jane Carter made two desperate calls for help. The first call brought police to her door. The second call captured the sound of gunshots that would ultimately end her life. Between those calls, a series of failures by law enforcement by a system designed to protect domestic violence victims sealed Michaela's fate. This isn't just another true crime story. This is a wake-up call about the invisible epidemic of domestic violence, the loopholes that allow abusers to slip through the cracks, and the young woman whose death has sparked changes that might save other lives. Her story begins not with violence, but with hope. With dreams of community service, with the gentle voice of someone who sang in church choirs and greeted guests with a smile. Someone who had no way of knowing that the boy she met in high school would become the man who would take everything from her. Today, we honor Michaela's memory by telling her story in full. The good and bad times, the missed opportunities, and the final moments. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that hurt the most to tell. Michaela Jane Carter entered this world on November 23, 1996, in the small city of Bowling Green, Kentucky. Born to parents who would relocate the family to Antioch, Tennessee, just outside Nashville, Michaela grew up in a community where neighbors knew each other's names, and church bells marked the rhythm of Sunday mornings. From an early age, Michaela displayed the qualities that would define her short but impactful life. As the oldest sibling in her family, she naturally assumed the role of protector and caregiver for her younger brothers and sisters. Those who knew her describe a young girl who never shirked responsibility, who could be found helping with homework, settling disputes between siblings, or simply being the steady presence her family could count on. The Carter family attended Lake Providence Baptist Church, where Michaela found two of her greatest passions, track and field, and singing in the youth choir. On the track, she channeled her natural determination and competitive spirit. Her coaches remember a teenager who might not have been the fastest runner, but who never gave up, who pushed through pain and exhaustion with a smile that could light up the darkest days. But it was in the church choir where Michaela's soul truly soared. Her voice, clear and strong, carried the kind of faith that ran deep in her bones. She wasn't performing when she sang, she was worshiping, pouring her heart into every hymn and spiritual song. Her baptism at Freedom Temple Ministries wasn't just a religious ceremony, it was the public declaration of a faith that would sustain her through challenges no young person should ever face. As Michaela entered her 20s, that same caring spirit that made her such a devoted sister led her to the service industry. She found work at the 1230 Club in Nashville, where she served as both server and greeter. Regular customers quickly learned to look forward to Michaela's warm welcome, her genuine interest in their lives, and her ability to remember not just drink orders but personal details, how someone's job interview went, whether their sick parent was feeling better, if their child's school play was a success. Her manager at the 1230 Club later recalled that Michaela was the kind of employee every business dreams of having. She arrived early, stayed late when needed, and treated every customer like family. But more than that, she treated her coworkers with the same warmth and respect. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who organized small celebrations for personal milestones, who offered a listening ear during tough times. Outside of work, Michaela harbored bigger dreams. She spoke often about her desire to host community events, not for profit but for purpose. She envisioned charity drives that could help local families in need, community gatherings that could bring neighbors together, events that could make a real difference in people's lives. Her friends remember her excitement when discussing these plans, the way her eyes would light up as she described barbecues, for single mothers, clothing drives for children, holiday celebrations for seniors who might otherwise spend them alone. This wasn't idle talk for Michaela. She began putting plans into motion, reaching out to local churches and community centers, researching what permits she might need, even starting to save money for her first event. She had the organizational skills, the people skills, and most importantly, the heart to make these dreams reality. Those who knew Michaela best describe her as someone who never met a stranger. She had the gift of making people feel seen and valued, whether it was a regular customer at the restaurant, a fellow churchgoer, or someone she just met. She possessed that rare combination of genuine kindness and inner strength that drew people to her like moths to a flame. Her faith remained central to everything she did. She wasn't preachy or judgmental. Instead, she lived her beliefs through her actions. She volunteered whenever possible, whether it was helping with church events, assisting elderly, neighbors with groceries, or simply being present for friends going through difficult times. Her pastor later said that Michaela embodied the very best of what it means to be a person of faith in the modern world. But perhaps what made Michaela most special was her resilience. Life wasn't always easy for her. The family faced financial struggles like many working-class families. There were times when making ends meet required sacrifice and creativity, yet Michaela never complained, never let circumstances diminish her optimism or her commitment to helping others. She had dreams beyond Antioch, beyond Nashville even. She talked about maybe going back to school someday, perhaps studying social work or event management. She wanted to travel, to see the world beyond Tennessee's borders. But she also wanted to come back, to invest in her community, to be part of making life better, for people who, like her, were working hard and deserving of support and opportunity. As 2021 progressed, Michaela was looking forward to her 25th birthday on November 23rd. She had been planning a small celebration with family and close friends, nothing fancy, but filled with the love and laughter that characterized all of Michaela's gatherings. She had been talking about it for weeks. Who she would invite, what food she would serve, maybe even organizing a small charity component where guests could bring donations for a local shelter. November 23, 2021 would indeed be a significant date in Michaela Carter's story, but not for the reasons she had hoped and planned. What none of her friends, family members, or co-workers knew as they watched Michaela live her life with such purpose and joy was that beneath the surface, a dangerous situation was developing. A situation involving someone from her past, someone who refused to accept that his place in her future had ended. The vibrant, caring, faithful young woman who greeted customers with genuine warmth, who sang in church choirs with a voice full of hope, who dreamed of community events that could change lives. This same woman was about to become the victim of a system that would fail her at every critical juncture. But before we can understand those failures, we need to understand how Michaela's path first crossed with the man who would ultimately take her life. The year was 2007, and Michaela Carter was just 11 years old when she first encountered James Leget in the hallways of their Antioch, Tennessee high school. Like many teenage relationships, theirs began innocently enough. Shared classes, casual conversations, the gradual building of familiarity that can develop into friendship and eventually something more. For 3 years, Michaela and James moved in the same social circles without any romantic involvement. James was older, more experienced, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that often appeals to younger students. When Michaela turned 14 in 2010, James, then 17, began pursuing her more seriously. To Michaela, still forming her understanding of relationships and love, the attention from an older boy felt flattering, mature, exciting. What Michaela couldn't recognize at 14 were the early warning signs that domestic violence experts now know to watch for. James's interest in her came with strings attached, subtle at first, but present from the very beginning. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He expressed displeasure when she spent time with friends without him. He had opinions about her clothes, her activities, her family relationships. To teenage Michaela, these behaviors might have seemed like signs of how much James cared about her. He was protective, attentive, interested in every detail of her life. The possessiveness that would later escalate to dangerous levels initially masqueraded as devotion. As their relationship developed through Michaela's high school years, James' control tactics became more sophisticated and more restrictive. He began monitoring her phone, demanding to see her text messages and call logs. He would show up unexpectedly at her workplace, her church, her family gatherings, not as a supportive boyfriend, but as someone checking up on her, making sure she wasn't doing anything he disapproved of. James was particularly threatened by Michaela's close relationships with her family and her church community. These were people who knew Michaela well. who loved her for who she was, and who might notice changes in her behavior or express concerns about her relationship. Gradually, James began creating friction between Michaela and these important people in her life. He would pick fights with her family members, create drama around church events, and manufacture crises. That required Michaela's immediate attention whenever she had plans that didn't include him. Slowly but surely, Michaela found herself increasingly isolated from the support systems that had always been central to her life. The isolation wasn't just social, it was emotional and psychological as well. James had a talent for undermining Michaela's confidence and self-worth. He would criticize her appearance, her intelligence, her dreams and aspirations. He would build her up one day and tear her down the next, creating a cycle of emotional instability that kept her constantly trying to regain his approval. Friends and family members began to notice changes in Michaela during these years. The girl who had once been so outgoing and confident became quieter, more anxious. She made excuses for James's behavior and seemed to walk on eggshells around him. When loved ones expressed concerns, Michaela would defend him, insisting that people just didn't understand their relationship. This pattern, isolation, control, emotional manipulation followed by periods of apparent affection, is the classic cycle of domestic abuse. But for someone living inside it, especially someone who entered the relationship as a young teenager, still learning about love and relationships, it can be nearly impossible to recognize. As James entered his 20s, his behavior extended beyond emotional and psychological abuse into criminal activity. Between 2013 and 2017, he accumulated a series of felony convictions that painted a clear picture of a young man with little respect for the law or other people's rights. Drug possession charges suggested ongoing substance abuse issues. Burglary and robbery convictions showed a willingness to violate others' safety and security for personal gain. Crucially, these criminal convictions legally barred James from owning or possessing firearms, a restriction that would prove tragically irrelevant when the time came for enforcement. Despite James's criminal history, despite the clear pattern of escalating antisocial behavior, Michaela remained in the relationship. This might seem incomprehensible to observers, but domestic violence experts understand that leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time for victims. Abusers frequently escalate their violence when they sense their control slipping away. The year 2020 brought an incident that should have served as a wake-up call for everyone involved. During a confrontation at his parents' home, James physically assaulted his own mother and father, shoving his mother and pointing his father's gun at her. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control. This was calculated intimidation using a deadly weapon against the people who had given him life. Initially, James was arrested and charged for this domestic violence incident, but in a pattern that would repeat itself with tragic consequences, the charges were eventually dropped when his parents declined to cooperate with prosecution. Whether this was due to fear, family loyalty, hope that James could change, or simple exhaustion with the criminal justice system, the result was the same. James faced no consequences for threatening his mother's life with a firearm. This incident also established James's knowledge of and access to firearms, despite his legal prohibition from possessing them. The gun he used to threaten his mother was his father's weapon, and rather than being properly secured after the incident, it remained accessible to someone who had already demonstrated he would use it to threaten family members. By 2021, Michaela had been in this toxic, controlling relationship for over a decade. The confident, outgoing girl who had entered the relationship at 14 was now a 24-year-old woman whose world had been systematically narrowed by years of manipulation and control. Yet somehow, through it all, she maintained her core identity, her faith, her kindness, her desire to help others. Perhaps it was this inner strength, this connection to who she really was beneath the abuse, that finally gave Michaela the courage to begin taking steps to free herself from James's control. But as she would tragically learn, sometimes the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship is when the victim finally says enough. The events of 2021 would test every system designed to protect domestic violence victims, and every one of those systems would fail Michaela when she needed them most. July 2021 marked a turning point in Michaela Carter's relationship with James Leget, but not the kind of turning point that leads to healing and recovery. Instead, it was the beginning of a terrifying escalation that would expose every crack, every failure, every inadequacy in the systems designed to protect domestic violence victims. The incident that finally pushed Michaela to seek legal protection was as shocking as it was predictable. During what witnesses described as a typical argument between the couple, James lost control completely. He grabbed a glass bottle and struck Michaela with it, leaving her injured and, for the first time in their long relationship, genuinely afraid for her life. This wasn't name-calling or emotional manipulation. This wasn't pushing or grabbing. This was a deliberate act of violence using a weapon, leaving visible injuries that couldn't be explained away or minimized. For Michaela, who had endured years of psychological and emotional abuse, this physical assault represented a line being crossed that she couldn't ignore. Gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, Michaela made the decision that domestic violence advocates tell us is often the hardest one a victim can make. She decided to seek help through the legal system. She filed for a protective order against James, officially documenting the abuse, and asking the courts to legally prohibit him from contacting or approaching her. But the legal system that was supposed to protect Michaela immediately began failing her in ways that would prove catastrophic. First, assault charges were filed against James for the bottle attack. This should have been a straightforward case. There was physical evidence, witness testimony, and a victim willing to cooperate with prosecution. But when the court date arrived, something went wrong. Accounts vary about exactly what happened that day, but the result was clear. Michaela panicked and left the courthouse before the proceedings were complete. Whether she was overwhelmed by the legal process, intimidated by James's presence, afraid of potential retaliation, or simply emotionally unprepared for the trauma of testifying against someone she had loved for over a decade, Michaela's departure gave the court grounds to dismiss the assault charges. Just like that, James faced no criminal consequences for attacking Michaela with a glass bottle. The message sent was unmistakable. The system would not hold him accountable for violence against her. However, the protective order process continued separately from the criminal charges. In August 2021, a judge granted Michaela's request for protection, legally prohibiting James from contacting her, approaching her home or workplace, or coming within a specified distance of her. On paper, this order represented the full force of the law standing between Michaela and her abuser. In reality, the protective order proved to be little more than meaningless paperwork. James was arrested on unrelated charges and spent several months in jail on a probation violation. During this time, Michaela experienced what may have been the first real peace she'd known in years. She could go to work without looking over her shoulder. She could spend time with family without fear of unexpected confrontations. She could begin to imagine what life might be like free from the constant anxiety that had become her normal state. But on November 2021, James was released from jail and the harassment began immediately. Despite the protective order that legally prohibited any contact with Michaela, James began reaching out to her through Facebook messages and text messages. These weren't apologetic attempts at reconciliation. They were threatening communications that made clear his anger at her for seeking legal protection and his intention to continue exerting control over her life. Each message James sent to Michaela was a criminal violation of the protective order. Each text, each Facebook message, each attempt to contact her represented a crime that should have resulted in his immediate arrest. But for reasons that remain unclear, these violations were not properly investigated or prosecuted. The harassment escalated beyond digital communications. James began showing up at places where he knew Michaela might be, following her, making his presence known in ways designed to intimidate and frighten her. Again, each of these incidents represented clear violations of the protective order, yet James continued to walk free. The situation reached a crisis point on November 15, 2021. James's harassment had become so intense and frightening that Michaela and her mother felt they had no choice but to call 911 for emergency assistance. During that call, they specifically told the dispatcher that James was outside Michaela's residence and that he had a gun. The response to this 911 call would represent the final, most devastating failure in a long series of system breakdowns. When Nashville police officers arrived at Michaela's home, they encountered a situation that should have triggered multiple protective protocols. They had a domestic violence victim with an active protective order reporting that her abuser was outside her home with a firearm. This scenario represents one of the highest risk situations in domestic violence cases. Exactly the kind of situation that protective orders and police response protocols are designed to address. But the officers who responded that night failed to follow basic procedures that might have saved Michaela's life. They failed to activate their body cameras, meaning there would be no record of what was said or done during this critical encounter. They failed to conduct a lethality assessment, a standard procedure designed to evaluate how much immediate danger a domestic violence victim faces. Most critically, they failed to arrest James, despite clear evidence that he was violating the protective order by being present at Michaela's residence. Instead of treating this as the emergency it was, the responding officers essentially dismissed the situation. Their advice to Michaela was to take a photo if she saw James again, as if documenting. Violations after the fact would somehow protect her from imminent violence. The officers left Michaela and her family that night with no protection, no safety plan, and no confidence that the system designed to help domestic violence victims would actually help when it mattered most. What the officers didn't know, what they might have discovered if they had conducted a proper investigation, was that James had immediate access to the same gun he had used to threaten his parents the year before. The weapon that had already been used in one domestic violence incident was still available to someone who was legally prohibited from possessing firearms and who was now violating a protective order. Within minutes of the police leaving Michaela's home, James would return, and this time, he brought the gun. November 15th, 2021, was supposed to be just another Monday night for Michaela Carter. In 8 days, she would turn 25. She had been planning a small birthday celebration with family and friends, looking forward to marking another year of life despite the difficulties she had been facing with James Leget's continued harassment. But as evening fell in Antioch, Tennessee, Michaela found herself living through every domestic violence victim's worst nightmare, the moment when threats become reality, when psychological terror transforms into physical danger, and when all the systems designed to provide protection reveal themselves to be inadequate. The evening began with Michaela and her mother noticing James outside their home. Despite the protective order that legally prohibited him from being anywhere near her residence, there he was, a clear violation that should have resulted in immediate arrest if reported to police. But more terrifying than his presence was what they observed him carrying, a gun. For Michaela, this sighting represented the convergence of her worst fears. James had already demonstrated his capacity for violence by attacking her with a glass bottle just months earlier. He had shown his willingness to use firearms to threaten family members when he pointed a gun at his own mother. Now he was outside her home, armed, in direct violation of a court order designed to keep her safe at. Approximately 10:30 p.m., Michaela and her mother made the call that should have saved her life. They dialed 911 and reported that James was outside their home with a gun. The dispatcher who took their call heard the fear in their voices, documented the presence of an armed individual violating a protective order, and dispatched officers to respond to what should have been treated as a high-priority emergency. The responding Nashville Metro police officers arrived to find a situation that, according to department protocols and domestic violence best practices, should have triggered immediate protective action. They had a documented domestic violence victim with an active protective order, reporting that her abuser was present at her residence with a firearm. This represents what experts call a high lethality situation. Exactly the type of scenario that protective orders and emergency response protocols are designed to address. But instead of following established procedures, the responding officers made a series of decisions that would have fatal consequences. First, they failed to activate their body cameras. This wasn't an oversight or technical malfunction. It was a decision not to document what would prove to be a critical interaction. The absence of body camera footage would later make it impossible to determine exactly what was said between the officers and Michaela, what assessment was made of the danger she faced, or what instructions were given. The officers spoke with Michaela and her family, but failed to conduct what's known as a lethality assessment, a series of questions designed to evaluate how much immediate danger a domestic violence victim faces. These assessments, when properly conducted, help officers understand whether a victim is at imminent risk of being killed by their abuser. Given that Michaela was reporting that James had appeared at her home with a gun in violation of a protective order, her danger level should have been assessed as extreme. Most critically, the officers failed to arrest James despite clear evidence that he was violating the protective order. Whether they were unable to locate him in the immediate area, chose not to search thoroughly, or made some other decision, James was not taken into custody that night. He remained free to continue threatening Michaela. Instead of providing meaningful protection or developing a safety plan for a high-risk victim, the officers gave Michaela advice that was both inadequate and tone-deaf. They told her to take a photo if she saw James again. This suggestion revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the immediate danger Michaela faced. She wasn't dealing with a property dispute that could be resolved with documentation. She was dealing with an armed abuser who had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence. The officers left Michaela's home sometime around 11 p.m., believing they had handled the situation. They had taken a report, spoken with the complainant, and provided what they considered appropriate advice. In their minds, they had done their job. But James Leget had been watching. He had seen the police arrive, and he had seen them leave. Most importantly, he had seen that their response resulted in no consequences for him. The protective order that was supposed to keep him away from Michaela had proved meaningless. The police who were supposed to enforce it had proved ineffective. In James's mind, nothing stood between him and Michaela. Within minutes of the police departure, James returned to Michaela's home. This time, he wasn't just watching from outside. This time, he had decided to act. At 11:07 p.m., Michaela made her second 911 call of the evening. But this call was different from the first, where the earlier call had been a request for help, a plea for protection from a fearful victim. This second call was a whispered prayer from someone who knew death was at her door. "He's here," Michaela whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible. "He's outside." The 911 dispatcher could hear the terror in Michaela's voice, could sense that this was no longer a request for police response, but a final desperate attempt to document what was about to happen. The dispatcher tried to keep Michaela on the line, to gather information that might help responding. Officers to somehow provide comfort to a young woman who was facing her worst nightmare alone. Then the gunshots began. The 911 recording captured the sound of gunfire, multiple shots fired in rapid succession. The dispatcher heard glass breaking as James forced his way into the home. More gunshots followed, and then an eerie silence that spoke louder than any scream. James Leget had retrieved the same gun he had used to threaten his parents. The year before, his father's weapon that should have been secured after the 2020 domestic violence incident but had remained accessible to someone legally prohibited from possessing firearms. He had used that gun to force his way into Michaela's home and shoot her multiple times. When police arrived for the second time that evening, they found Michaela Carter dying from multiple gunshot wounds. She was rushed to a local hospital, where medical teams fought to save her life, but the damage was too severe. Michaela died in the early hours of November 16, 2021, just 8 days before her 25th birthday, just hours before the celebration she had been planning with family and friends. The young woman who had sung in church choirs, who had greeted restaurant customers with genuine warmth, who had dreamed of hosting community events to help others. She was gone, killed by the man she had once loved, failed by the systems she had trusted to protect her. In the immediate aftermath of Michaela Carter's murder, the quiet Antioch neighborhood, where she had lived, was transformed into a crime scene that would spark investigations, policy changes, and soul-searching questions about how a young woman with an active protective order could be killed by her abuser just minutes after police left her home. The investigation into Michaela's death began immediately, and what investigators found was a devastating series of failures that had created the perfect storm for tragedy. The gun used to kill Michaela was indeed the same weapon James Leget had, used to threaten his parents in 2020, his father's firearm, that had never been properly secured despite James's legal prohibition from possessing weapons due to his felony convictions. This discovery highlighted a critical gap in Tennessee law. Unlike many other states, Tennessee had no provisions requiring domestic abusers to surrender firearms when protective orders were issued against them. Despite overwhelming evidence that domestic violence incidents involving firearms are far more likely to result in death, the state's legal framework allowed known abusers to maintain access to weapons that could be used to carry out threats. The Nashville Metro Police Department launched an internal investigation into the officers' response on the night of November 15th. What they found was a catalog of protocol violations that had left Michaela defenseless when she needed protection most. The failure to activate body cameras violated department policy and eliminated crucial evidence about what had occurred during the police response. The absence of a lethality assessment meant that officers had no systematic way to evaluate how much danger Michaela faced. Most significantly, the decision not to arrest James for violating the protective order had left a dangerous abuser free to escalate his violence. As a result of the internal investigation, the responding officers faced professional consequences. Some were suspended without pay, others received formal reprimands, and all were required to undergo additional training on domestic violence response protocols. But for Michaela's family, these disciplinary actions felt inadequate in the face of such a preventable tragedy. The Carter family, while grieving the loss of their daughter and sister, made the difficult decision to pursue legal action against the Metro Nashville Police Department. Their wrongful death lawsuit argued that the department's failures had directly contributed to Michaela's death, and that systemic changes were needed to prevent similar tragedies in the future. In 2024, after years of legal proceedings, the city of Nashville agreed to a $250,000 settlement with Michaela's family. While no amount of money could bring Michaela back or fully compensate for their loss, the settlement represented an official acknowledgement that the police response had been inadequate and that changes were needed. More importantly than the financial settlement were the policy changes that emerged from Michaela's case. The Nashville Metro Police Department implemented mandatory body camera activation for all domestic violence calls, ensuring that future responses would be properly documented. They also instituted automatic BOLO be on the lookout alerts for individuals violating protective orders, meaning that officers throughout the city would be notified to arrest violators on site. Additionally, the department enhanced its domestic violence training, with particular emphasis on lethality, assessments, and the elevated risks faced by victims when abusers have access to firearms. Officers now receive specific instruction on recognizing high-risk situations and taking appropriate protective action. But perhaps the most significant change inspired by Michaela's death came at the state level. Her case became a rallying point for domestic violence advocates, pushing for stronger firearms restrictions for abusers. The statistic that 40% of domestic homicides in Nashville involved illegally held guns became a powerful argument for requiring abusers to surrender weapons when protective orders are issued. While Tennessee has been slower to implement such changes than advocates would like, Michaela's case continues to be cited in legislative discussions about closing the deadly gap between protective orders and actual protection. The investigation into Michaela's murder took an unexpected turn in July 2024 when James Leget was found dead in his jail cell while awaiting trial. The circumstances of his death remain under investigation, with authorities trying to determine whether it was suicide, natural causes, or something else entirely. For Michaela's family, James's death meant they would never see him held fully accountable in court for taking their daughter's life. Yet even without a trial, James's death couldn't diminish the broader impact of Michaela's story. Her case had already become a catalyst for change, a stark example of what happens when systems fail domestic violence victims at their most vulnerable moments. Michaela's family has worked to ensure that her legacy extends beyond the tragedy of her death to encompass the joy and service that characterized her life. They've spoken at domestic violence awareness events, sharing both their grief and their determination to prevent other families from experiencing similar losses. They've supported legislative efforts to strengthen protections for abuse victims and advocated for better training for law enforcement officers who respond to domestic violence calls. The message they consistently share is simple but powerful: protective orders must mean real protection. Having a piece of paper that says an abuser can't contact a victim is meaningless unless the legal system is prepared to enforce that protection with immediate, decisive action when violations occur. Friends and family remember Michaela not just as a victim of domestic violence, but as a young woman whose life, though cut short, had touched countless others through her kindness, her faith, and her commitment to helping her community. The charity events she had dreamed of organizing have been held in her memory, with proceeds supporting domestic violence prevention programs and victim services. Her church, Lake Providence Baptist, has established programs in Michaela's honor to help young women recognize the warning signs of abusive relationships and connect with resources for help. Her former workplace, the 1230 Club, has partnered with local domestic violence organizations to ensure staff know how to recognize when customers might need help and how to connect them with appropriate services. The most haunting aspect of Michaela Carter's story is how preventable it was. At multiple points in the timeline leading to her death, different decisions by law enforcement, by the courts, or by the legal system could have saved her life. The protective order could have been properly enforced. The responding officers could have followed protocols. James could have been arrested for his violations and held accountable for his threats. Instead, Michaela became another statistic in America's epidemic of domestic violence, one of the approximately 1,500 women killed by current or former intimate partners each year. But her story has ensured that her death was not in vain, that the failures that cost her life have been examined, acknowledged, and addressed so that other women might be saved. As we conclude Michaela's story, we remember her not as she died, afraid and alone, but as she lived, full of faith, kindness, and hope for a better future. Though that future was stolen from her, the changes inspired by her death may help ensure that other young women get the chance to live the full, meaningful lives that Michaela deserved. That is her legacy, a reminder that behind every domestic violence statistic is a real person with dreams, relationships, and contributions to make to the world. and a call to action that we must do better in our laws, our policies, and our responses to protect those who cannot protect themselves.